This year's documentary is on chaplains at Gallipoli and the Western Front, and their story took me by surprise. It's emotional, it's terrifying, it's horrifying, but it's inspiring beyond measure. I'm here at the Australian Defence Force Academy, and I'm at the Chaplains College. And this is where chaplains, or Padres as they're known, are trained. As you walk through the hallway of the college, heritage and tradition stalk you. And then you look at the photographs on the wall and you think of things like honour and courage and sacrifice. These two photographs right beside me just typify what I've just said. These are of two naval chaplains, Ron Bevington and George Stubbs. Bevington lost his life on the HMAS Perth when it was sunk in June 1940. And Stubbs lost his life on the HMAS Sydney when it was sunk by the German raider, the Cormorant. But this is the photograph that I really want to show you. This is of Andrew Gillison, the first chaplain killed at Gallipoli. And this photo shows him preaching his last message to the troops before he died. As the new chaplains walked these hallways, I wonder if they had any idea of what the chaplains at Gallipoli and the Western Front went through. I can tell you, I had no idea.
And any pastor will tell you, you conduct a funeral during the week or maybe a couple, and the emotional drain just from that experience. So the numbers that they were dealing with, absolutely staggering. So I don't know how you could be prepared.
We actually know quite a lot about the chaplains because they kept extensive journals and wrote many letters. As I stand amongst these photographs of modern day chaplains, I want to tell you about the four chaplains that we're going to listen to throughout this documentary. The first one is Father John Fay, and he's an incredible figure because he disobeyed orders to stay on the ships at Gallipoli and was one of the only chaplains to actually storm the beach. That experience changed him forever. And then we have perhaps the most famous chaplain, William Fighting Mac Mckenzie, a Salvation Army officer who became a chaplain, and what a man he was. Just his physical appearance, 6'2", 190 centimetres in the modern language, 17 stone, 110 kilos. He was awarded the Military Cross, and rumour has it that he was nominated for the Victoria Cross on 3 occasions. Then we have Dexter. Now, he kept the best journals of all. He stayed the longest at Gallipoli and also ended up being one of the last chaplains to leave Western France. We're going to hear from him a lot throughout this particular story that I'm going to tell you. And then we have Andrew Gillison. Now, I've mentioned him before. He was the first chaplain killed at Gallipoli, and we're going to listen to his story quite intently. When King George V declared war against Germany, Australian Prime Minister Andrew Fisher followed suit straight away and immediately called for Australian men to rally and enlist. And they did, in huge numbers. And the same was for chaplains. Churches put out a call for chaplains to join and be part of this almost, in a sense, adventure. Well, believe it or not, there was more chaplains applied than positions available, and they joined in huge numbers. They weren't trained in any manner or form. In fact, some were only appointed the week before they were due to leave for overseas. As they got to know their men, especially on the troop ships on the way to Egypt, a real intimacy started to be established between the men and the chaplains. Now, this had a double-edged sword. This intimacy was going to be strained considerably as the chaplains started to bury the very men that they'd got to know so well. It's a little before 4:30 a.m. on the 25th of April 1915. Australia is going to war. Father John Fay wants to be with his beloved 3rd Brigade. He wants to hit the beach with his boys. So he completely disregards any order to stay on the ships. He describes the scene, a faint glimmer of dawn. The boats, one of which is behind me, completely packed with men, so much so that one bullet would kill 3 men in one go. He then describes the scene as he comes upon the beach. The men pile out of the boats, and he, together with them, makes a dash up the beach. The Maxim machine gun, which has 600 rounds per minute, the noise of that, John Fay tells, is horrendous. As he approaches the beach, there's a small little bank produced by the tide of the day, and he and 2 other men, one beside him and the other on the other side, crouch down and start digging. The 2 men beside him have digging tools. Fay doesn't have anything, so he uses his hands. In that moment, the man on his right is shot dead. The man on his left is shot dead. And Fay abandons any sense of digging a trench and dashes towards the cliffs ahead. John Fay had only just survived. 4 shrapnel hits through his haversack, 2 bullet holes through his greatcoat, a book that he was carrying shot out of his hand. And then when he got to the trenches, 4 shells so close, one of which completely buried him when it exploded. He actually had to be dug out. There were only 2 doctors and a few orderlies, so the chaplains had to step in. Padre Dexter kept the best journals for this particular day. He describes the fact that on the barges and hospital ships there were 700 wounded. Between 3 p.m. and 8 p.m, 140 wounded men per hour, and some of them will not survive the night. It's an incredible story that all the chaplains helped out. About 11:30 that night, Dexter and the other chaplains finished up. And Dexter wrote in his journal. It's an incredibly moving part. He says, "I want to cry. Shattered limbs, bullets in the head, through the body and in every conceivable manner." The only pain relief given in those days was iodine. He goes on to further write. He says, "The air is terribly putrid, like a stale butcher's shop that has not been cleaned for a month. The smell of stale blood and perspiration is particularly trying. This horrible smell of blood," he writes, "seems to hang on me and not go away. And I dreamed of blood all the time." All of the chaplains at this stage are desperate to get ashore. They want to join the men, but rumours are rife. Mckenzie writes of one particular rumour where he hears that out of 20,000 British troops, only 10,000 are remaining. Yet that doesn't detract from the fact that they want to get on the beaches. At this point, what the chaplains didn't realise was that the commanders of this Gallipoli campaign were already talking about evacuation. When they did get to the shore, there was no time for concerts or the normal things that they would organise. What they had to centre themselves on was tending to the wounded, but burying the dead. Mckenzie writes really clearly about what it was like to be a chaplain, especially in relation to the burials. Now you've got to understand that these chaplains came from parish situations where the funerals they did were in very sanctified situations. All that changed when they got to Gallipoli. The process that Mckenzie describes is harrowing. Now he's talking about his 1st Brigade. These are men that he's worked with, these are the men that he lives with, these are the men that he's in the dugouts with. And by this stage of the Gallipoli campaign, 1/3 of them have been killed. Mckenzie describes the process of the burials. He, together with a small group of men, go out and recover the bodies. This usually takes place at about 11 p.m. Not only does he recover the bodies, but he goes through the men's personal effects because they've got to be sent back to the family and to relatives. And he's also aware that he's got to write letters as well. So he wants to get as much personal information as he can. The bodies are then gathered and they go to a secluded spot, usually where others have been buried prior to this, and they start the burial service. Now we think of that burial service in terms of being, well, fairly ordinary, but you've got to understand that the battles were still taking place, snipers were still active, and the Turks were still offering shots towards the Australians even at night. So Mckenzie describes the situation as having to do these funerals, these burials, on his knees. The Australian chaplains decided that they wanted to be close to their boys, so they lived in dugouts with them. Now it's an incredible scene because after April 25th and things settled down for a short period of time, they started to get into a regular routine. They would write letters for the men, because you've got to understand that many of the men were illiterate and couldn't write. They would write letters back home to friends and relatives and sweethearts. But in addition to that, they would just do the general chores that they wanted to do all along. They started to organise church services. They started to get close to the men as much as they could anyway. It's interesting because if you look at the diaries of some of the men, they tell the story that about 4 o'clock every Sunday, because that's when the Turkish troops took a bit of a break, out would come the chaplain. He'd come out of the dugout, he'd start to sing a hymn, and out of all the other dugouts, the men would follow him like rabbits out of their burrows. And they'd go to a secluded place where they could have the church service on a Sunday night. Even though they were non-combatants, the chaplains got involved.
I've got a friend who's researched battalion commanders in the First World War, and that research has shown that soldiers placed a premium on the character, on the fighting ability of their commander, rather than their rank and their position within the army hierarchy. A person had to prove themselves, and chaplains found that Australian soldiers would quickly take their measure, and they really had to earn the respect, the sympathy and the friendship or affection of Australian soldiers. And some chaplains, of course, were able to do that quite effectively.
Monday, the 24th of May, 1915. Now this particular Monday, in fact this particular day, no man on Gallipoli is ever going to forget. If you read some of the journals once again, you find phrases like full of misery, horrible, terrible. A day that's regarded as the worst day that anyone could spend upon Gallipoli. So why was it so bad? Well, in fact, it was a day that they called Armistice Day, even though that was later given to the 11th of November, 1918. But on this day, a ceasefire had been organised between the Turks and the Australians to go into no man's land and recover the bodies of the soldiers that had been killed and had lain there, some of them, since the 25th of April. The two sides tentatively climbed out of their trenches. They greeted each other just for a brief period of time, because time was short, and then they proceeded. The chaplains had to lead the way. Every single body. Now let's just stop there and think about this. Some of those bodies, putrid, decomposing, horrible. The smell was something that everyone writing about that day remembers. The chaplains had to go through each body, take out the personal effects, individually identify them, and then that body would be gently put on a stretcher and carried back to the lines. By 4 o'clock, it was done. And both sides stood for a moment looking at each other. They shook each other's hand, wished each other good luck, and went back to the trenches. Within a few minutes, hostilities started again.
Even the physical, the emotional impact. I mean, I imagine there comes a point where you start to be conditioned to that routine, but that has its limits. You can only do that up to a certain point. And so in ministry, in general life, there's an element of compassion fatigue, but you exaggerate that, you multiply that by millions, really. Compassion fatigue, post-traumatic stress, moral injury, these things that we're really only starting to understand now, it has to have impacted them. And yet, some thrived, that their ministry thrived, they did it. So these experiences, they draw you closer to your Creator and your reliance on Him, but sometimes it can be a challenge to your faith and really a dent to your soul.
If the chaplains at Gallipoli thought that they'd seen the worst, that was certainly not the case. A battle was about to take place which would shock them all. In the War Memorial here we have this diorama. It's the Battle of Lone Pine. 7 Victoria Crosses were won by Australians. Mckenzie particularly was moved by this battle because it involved his beloved 1st Battalion.
chaplains are with their troops in dangerous environments, and you know, you can't be an effective chaplain unless you're with your soldiers. In today's chaplaincy, we have a tagline. It's almost like a brand line, position to serve, but it tells the message of proximity and accessibility and even credibility in sharing the same conditions.
3,200 Australians went into the battle. 3 days later, 1,200 remained. 800 were killed and many were missing. Some of the wounds were awful and many must die or be crippled for life. My experiences of getting the wounded out of the trenches, over the dead and wounded, underneath the dead, were truly sickening. Mckenzie talks about the fact that the smell was so awful that he vomited constantly. He became ill. In fact, during this period of time, he became so ill that he was unable to walk, but refused to go to the back of the line. He got a walking stick and crawled to help his men. This is a man that was so ill on that particular day, and the officers around him were demanding that he stop and go out of the line. But Mckenzie's love for his boys held him to that particular position. There's no way he was going to leave his boys.
In a number of ways. In the first place, they experienced an intense feeling of camaraderie, of brotherhood, what we know as esprit de corps, this experience that's forged, this brotherhood on the battlefield, where only those who've been in that intense experience know what it's like. And so only they really understand each other. They experience this extraordinary sense of community with soldiers on the front lines and with other chaplains. Many actually complained of coming back to Australia and really missing that close and deep sense of community.
If you go to the site of the Battle of the Lone Pine today, there's a cemetery. There are 1,167 graves, and of those, 471 are unknown. In fact, this place is so special that the annual Gallipoli service is held on that spot. There is no more fitting place to tell you about the next part of the story. We're at Anzac Memorial Chapel at Duntroon. On the 22nd of August 1915, things became very personal for the chaplains. An event took place which brought war home to them. Now, Andrew Gillison was much revered, and he'd only a couple of days before preached a message to all the troops. And on this particular day, he was in a trench and he heard the cry of a soldier that had been wounded and was lying in no man's land. Every soldier in that trench knew that it was suicide to go and attempt to rescue the soldier. There were Turkish snipers that were focused on that particular area. There was also a machine gun just off to the side. So no soldier was going to go into no man's land. But Gillison couldn't resist the call and the cries of this soldier. Together with a Methodist minister who had enrolled in the army just as a stretcher bearer, they came out of the trench, raced towards the man, grabbed him and hauled him back towards the trench. But unfortunately, both were mortally wounded by the Turkish snipers. Gillison passed away a few hours later, and Australia had lost its first chaplain killed in action. Over the next few months, more useless battles took place, and unfortunately, more men died as a result of those battles, until finally it was decided that no more. An evacuation was ordered on the 20th of December 1915. Padre Dexter, in the nights prior to the evacuation, had collected some silver wattle seeds and brought them all the way from Australia. And he wandered through the gullies at night, spreading those wattle seeds. He wrote in his journal later on, "I intend that a little part of Australia shall remain here." You can imagine how many burials chaplains did at the Western Front. In fact, one British padre estimated that over the time he was there, he did 25,000 burials. Another said that he buried between 5,000 and 6,000 men in a mere 15-week period.
That's what these chaplains of that era did, and I'm in awe of it. I can't imagine, and yet I see our chaplains doing amazing things even today, so it fills me with hope and a confidence that we share that ministry, we build on that legacy, but I don't think, and I pray, we'll never see that kind of ministry again, those conditions.
Chaplain Kenneth Henderson describes the scene in his journals as he worked in a hospital. He said the triage was something that he never got used to. Men being brought in, great waves of men, droves of men, hideously injured. And then one doctor would simply go around the men, marking them with a red pen. And then occasionally he would simply nod to the chaplain. And that meant a secret signal that the chaplain was to go and give the last rites to that particular man because there was no hope. Chaplain Gerard Tucker writes of one experience when he was in the hospital late one night. He says there was a young boy and he was dying. He was only semi-conscious, and in a very weak voice he started to talk of home. Tucker writes that he heard the boy use the word mother more than once, and then on occasions there were other names, Dick and Kate, and then the young boy lapsed into silence. Tucker writes, all of a sudden there was quiet, save the sound of weak breathing. The end was near. When I opened my eyes, his soul had fled. Tucker then describes taking this young man with a few of the patients who were also at the hospital and burying him in a field outside the hospital. The war ends. 62,000 Australians die. It's hard to imagine that number. Countless more suffer physical injuries. Countless more suffer mental anguish. And they eventually are repatriated home. The chaplains are the last to leave. This war has taken a toll upon Australian society, but it's taken a toll on the chaplains. Towards the end of the war, the mental toll upon the participants was quite obvious. And actually, a name was given to that mental toll. It was shell shock. Nowadays, of course, we call it post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But in those days, it was totally undiagnosed.
So they saw at close hand what was happening in terms of psychological effects of post-traumatic stress. Some of these chaplains identified in their diaries, Kenneth Henderson, for example, the Anglican Padre, noted how their experience in the hospitals would be like a crust. They would keep a kind of a psychological hardness and crust to get through their experience on the battlefield. But after some weeks in a hospital, they would see that gradually falling away so that you could see them starting to experience emotions again, starting to make sense of their experience. And so chaplains accompanied them on that journey of recovery, and sometimes obviously not recovery. Some of these men didn't recover physically or psychologically. One of the best known chaplains, William Fighting Mac Mckenzie, for example, had, after he came back from the war, shocking nightmares. He would be found walking around the house in the middle of the night, looking for body parts of soldiers to piece together, looking for trench emplacements. He often slept on the floor because he thrashed around in his bed and sometimes fell out of his bed.
I say this very tentatively, but it does appear that the majority of the chaplains came back from Gallipoli in the Western Front and went into full-time ministry relatively unaffected.
Yeah, there were surprisingly few chaplains who didn't return to ministry. Of the statistics, only, for example, about 7% of Methodist chaplains didn't return to the ministry, only about 9% of Anglican chaplains. So it's fairly small, less than 10% of two of those major denominations.
It's certainly the case that chaplains Dexter and Henderson took some time out, but again, they came back to parish life.
Another Padre, Dexter, frequently complained of dreaming of the blood that he'd seen during the war, to the extent that he had to leave parish work temporarily and move to a soldier settlement farm before returning to ministry later on. Another Methodist chaplain who was at Lone Pine, AC Plain, had an extraordinary experience of post-traumatic stress afterwards, where he said he could not get the images and the sense of what he'd seen after burying hundreds of young men at Lone Pine. He said he had blood on the brain, and that led to a nervous breakdown, and he had to be taken back to Australia from Gallipoli.
There was a universal question continually being thrown at these chaplains. Padre, where is God in this? It seems that the chaplains actually counselled themselves to some degree. They talked amongst themselves. They had a brotherhood where they understood what each one was going through. And certainly it's quite clear that writing helped.
Articulating that experience for audiences back home, but also writing back to families. They were a key transmission point between the army and people back home that forged and continued those relationships with the soldiers that they'd known, and those relationships continued after the war as well. There was a mutual friendship and understanding between those they came back to.
Of our 4 chaplains, Dexter was the only one who saw Armistice Day. And on that particular day, he, like many of the Australian troops, celebrated very quietly. He held a service, and many men attended as they gathered around and remembered their friends, their mates, who were not there, who had perished during those 4 years of horrible warfare. By that stage, Fay and Mckenzie had gone home. They were weary, they were tired, and they'd been rested. Andrew Gillison lies in a military cemetery in Gallipoli. But as for the other 3, it's really interesting what happened. John Fay, he came back to Australia, and at first did not go back to the parish. He became the first president of the RSL in Western Australia. But soon, parish duties compelled him to go back into ministry. And he became a real advocate for, well, the underprivileged. He died in 1959. Mckenzie came back to Australia, again, weary and tired, as I said, but he was a hero. In fact, when he came back to Australia and disembarked from the ship, there were thousands of people waiting and cheering for him. He was the only chaplain who spoke at the funeral of Monash. He returned to parish duties straight away, as was his case really, and he was one of the major figures in the Salvation Army. He went to China eventually, he travelled back to London on a number of occasions, and passed away in 1947. He really became an icon of the Salvation Army to this day. And then we have Dexter. Dexter eventually came back to Australia and, like John Fay, couldn't quite settle into parish life. So he left the ministry for a brief period of time, taking up a soldier's settlement near Melbourne. But this didn't work out. And he returned to ministry and faithfully served in a number of parishes throughout Australia throughout his life, passing away in 1950. I'm here at the Ipswich RSL, and behind me is the shrine to our glorious dead. There's no doubt that the chaplains that we've spoken about would have buried some of these men. In reading the journals and the diaries and the accounts of these chaplains, I am so moved. I've become quite emotional as we've taken the journey with our 4 chaplains specifically. But beyond that, I just can't get over the terrible scenes that these chaplains witnessed, the environment that they lived in, and this incredible calling to be with their boys. They weren't behind the lines. They were not just in the front line, but often went beyond the front line into no man's land. Each one of them were just committed to not just serving God, but serving their men. And the toll and the sacrifice that they paid was immense. My whole view of chaplaincy and the concept of these men has completely changed. My respect, my admiration, their courage, their bravery has all affected me profoundly. I know we say, lest we forget, and sometimes I wonder if it just rolls off our lips. But I'm going to say, lest we forget, with a very specific thing in mind, and that's lest we forget the role that chaplains played in Gallipoli and the Western Front.